We're all set.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Finding the Source. I am Pete Carmichael, a professor of history here at Gettysburg College, also director of the Civil War Institute. I'm with Ashley Lusky, Dr. Ashley Lusky. She is the assistant director at CWI. And this is our last show for the season. And we are joined with Ken No. I'm going to give a little background on Ken. This is a momentous change in his life. He has retired from Auburn University. How many years were you at Auburn? Almost 20?
21.
21 years. So a little known fact, Mr. No, I applied for that Auburn job that you got. It's all worked out well for us both, I think, in the end. Yeah, no, I was there. There's a rare Civil War job, Southern history position, and Ken has been there. He's done wonderful work. I'll talk about his scholarship in just a moment. But first, we should note that he is an outstanding mentor to a number of graduate students. One of them who has gone on to have a very successful academic career, Jen Murray. Ken knows that Jen is a regular at CWI, not only giving talks, but she also does fantastic battlefield programs. So Ken has produced a number of graduate students, and of course, he's been a very active scholar. But we should give a little, or I should give a little background to Ken. I'm going to do this all off the top of my head. This might creep you out a little bit, Ken, that I know so much. Ready? Here we go. So born in Southwest Virginia, went to Emory and Henry College. And I know Emory and Henry well because I studied Emory and Henry in the 1850s. It's just a beautiful little place. And then from there, he went on to Virginia Tech. And I believe you were a student of Dr. James Robertson. Is that correct? Or you at least knew Dr. Robertson?
I knew Dr. Robertson. I got to know him better after I left Tech. That was my I want to be a British historian phase.
Yes, I knew that you flirted with European history, but
I did.
You returned to your roots, and in fact, when you returned to your roots, you did that at the University of Illinois, and your dissertation was on the title, I believe, was Railroads in Southwest Virginia, and it's a very important book. Did I get the title right? Yeah. It's an important book because, what's that? Close enough.
Close enough.
It's an important book because it is one that helped many of us see the slave society as not something that was insular from the inroads of global capitalism, that slavery was not just about farms and plantations, but that in fact the slave society moved toward what many would call modernization. So it's an excellent book. What's really remarkable about Ken's scholarship is that he's gone in many different directions. I won't list all of his books, but he's also done a campaign study. He did one on the campaign or the Battle of Perryville, which I believe University of Kentucky published. And then I have one of my favorite books, Ken's book, Reluctant Rebels. I know the glare is awful, published by UNC. And then tonight we're going to talk about his most recent book, published by LSU, The Howling Storm. There you have it. And before, again, we jump into this, I just want to, again, congratulate Ken. He has now finished his teaching tenure at Auburn. I'm sure that it's tough. You're not even in Auburn right now. You're at your new home in Urbana. He is professor emeritus. Now, he's not officially been granted that, but Ashley and I, we agreed that we would bestow that on you tonight. So this is a big night for you, Ken. Now, what we're all hoping for you, and if you'd like, we can do one of those GoFundMe accounts. I feel sorry for you, man. I would have thought that you'd got some bookshelves for all your books. And I love the closets. Those are beautiful doors. I'm not trying to knock it, but if you need some bookshelves, maybe you get some 2x4s and get some cinder blocks or something to do that. Whatever you need to do to start your new office.
I need bookshelves.
We all need bookshelves.
I have a basement. I have a basement for the first time in many, many years, and it's of the dimensions that I can almost replicate my office in Auburn. I just need bookshelves.
Yeah. So before we jump into the books, and I'm being serious here, man. You've had this really important, successful professional career, and Ken is one of those academics who's not like many that are aloof. He is just the opposite. He's engaging and open and just a wonderful and warm person. And of course, I never had you in the classroom, but I'm just kind of curious. What are some of the things that you're going to miss about Auburn, about teaching? And I should just quickly note that Ken is retired at the same time that his wife retired. Man, I've done my background work here. His wife was, I believe, in the library at Auburn.
She was.
She was, yeah.
She was.
So
Yeah.
obviously you've left a place that you've cared deeply about, lots of friends. Tell us, man, what's the stuff you're going to miss and what are you looking forward to in the future?
Well, I'm going to miss friends, obviously. There are a few people I'll miss quite a bit, I think, over the next few years. But insofar as Auburn, I mean, the great thing about Auburn, it's the students. They were wonderful from my first class. Obviously, there are a few exceptions here and there, but Auburn students were just great people and they were a lot of fun to be around. And I think they kept me younger than I would have been otherwise. And I really enjoyed working with them. And that's what I'm going to miss the most. I have this fear. You can't see it right now because all you can see are my closet doors. But I'm looking out my window. The backyard of our new house is actually a city park. And I have this sort of fear that I'm just going to be wandering around in the next 6 months, just walking up to people and imparting historical knowledge.
I
Hi,
think that
I
would
told
be,
you about the Peninsula Campaign. Um,
people are going to welcome that. Ken, I think you should do
I'm sure.
that. It's
Yeah,
going to make you immensely popular if you do that, I believe.
I'll be a very
Well,
popular
Ken,
neighbor for sure.
let's be honest, man. The biggest adjustment is going to be this: going from Auburn football to Illinois football. I mean, just not even waste your time with Illinois football. Just find a high school team somewhere to watch because it's just too painful.
Well, there's a high school up the road, Fisher High School, and their mascot is the bunnies. They're the bunnies, the Fisher bunnies.
Fierce.
And I was just strangely obsessed with the Fisher bunnies when I was in grad school here. So I can now go up and watch some Fisher games, I think.
Well, one last personal question here before we get to the book. I don't really care about baseball anymore. I lost interest some time ago. But when I loved baseball, it was in the 70s. And I was a diehard Reds fan, which means that I despise the Dodgers. And even
Yes,
though
I know.
I couldn't tell you a player on either team now, I see that Dodger emblem and it still makes me a little unhappy. I'm just curious where you're situated in Illinois. This will give you some flexibility. You can go to St. Louis and Chicago to see your Dodgers play. Is that part of the game plan here?
Sure, I can see the Dodgers in both cities. And
Yeah.
really, since high school, my favorite American League team has been the White Sox. So I actually plan on going to see them a lot too.
Okay, last trivia question here. Who's the greatest Dodger of all time?
Clearly Robinson.
Oh,
Clearly Robinson for his social impact.
okay.
Um, I'm a Dodger fan because my grandmother read about Jackie Robinson breaking the color line and thought that was a good thing,
That's cool. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
started rooting for the Dodgers and passed it on to me. And I mean, he affected a lot of lives, not just mine. That goes beyond what most athletes do.
Yeah,
So it's
absolutely.
meaningful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Ken, to think that you were able to put this book together while you're teaching and overseeing graduate students, and it's hard to imagine what you're going to do now that you have all this free time. If you don't squander it in the park and harass people with all your historical knowledge, we're expecting some more tomes like this. This is an impressive book on so many levels. Excited to talk to you about it. I'm going to get it started. And the first is, why should historians, and again, when we speak about this and we are talking about our audience, because we can, of course, consider them partners in crime in our great endeavors, why should we care and how should we bring environmental history into our study of military history?
I've come to the conclusion that we should care because our study of military history is incomplete until we do it. The soldiers, civilians at the time, all understood the importance of weather. They all write about it. I remember Bud Robertson telling a story when I did have him in class at Tech, and he told this long story about researching in archives and the frustrations of going to archives. You finally find a diary from a soldier in a regiment you're interested in, and you open it up, and darn, there's nothing in it but weather information.
Right.
I love those diaries, by the way. That's what they wrote about. That's what they cared about. They lived in a world that was much more outside than ours is. They were part of the environment, I think, in many ways more than we are. They made certain assumptions about how the world worked that we've kind of lost sitting here in our air conditioning. in our classrooms. So I think if we really want to understand the experience, if we really want to understand in some ways why campaigns ended up the way they did or what happened on the home front, we have to bring in that environmental dimension. What we do normally when we write military history of the Civil War is that it's background. It's the stage back there. And, occasionally it thunders or there's lightning or, something happens, the mud march happens and it rains a lot. But by and large, we dismiss weather. We make assumptions. George McClellan can't get up the peninsula as fast as we would like him to do so. Well, he must be petulant. He must be a coward. He must be timid. When in fact, the major problem there was that it pretty much rained every other day on some really porous soil that created incredibly deep mud, and it was literally impossible for that army to move up the peninsula any faster than it did. That's just an example, I think, of how, in a way, we misunderstand what happened in the war if we take it out of its environmental context and pretend that it took place in the Dome in Indianapolis, an air-conditioned environment that's always temperature controlled, and it doesn't rain inside.
Yeah. Before I switch it over to Ashley, I just want to say that your fascination and it's a serious study of soil composition, and I can only imagine that at the dinner table at night that you going on at great lengths about this. Did your wife ever say, "Hey, this conversation's stuck in the mud"?
It's like you're reading my mind right now.
Ashley's embarrassed for me. That says something, right? I cannot help myself. I'm sorry.
Well, you shouldn't, because you're very close. You're very close to the truth, because the book didn't have a title until near the end, so we just called it things. I always called it the weather book. My wife Nancy called it the mud book. And as she likes to point out, I did spend a lot of time at dinner talking about mud.
I noticed in your acknowledgments that two of our colleagues at the seminary here in Gettysburg, that I don't know how you inspired them to drive around Adams County to find samples of red clay or something like that. Hell, all they need to do is, Ashley and I live fairly close to each other. Man, our yard here is just junk, man. It's clay and rock. So they didn't actually need to go very far. They could have come to my garden. But that would have actually disturbed the deer who come and devour everything that I plant, even though the deer have a salad bar in the National Park Service, right, that they could eat with impunity. I'm getting us a little bit off track. Obviously, I have some issues here with the deer in my garden. So, we'll talk some about soil composition. I'm serious. We'll do that at some point. I'll switch it over here to Ashley. I promise, Ashley, no more bad puns. That's the last one.
Well, I do have to mention your bad pun of this morning. Leaving our staff meeting, he said, "I'll see you tonight, Ashley, weather permitting." So
ho ho.
They continue.
Man, I'm not very creative when it comes to this stuff. I'm just getting warmed up here.
We won't rain on your parade.
So my question kind of goes back to, you mentioned that this is a relatively new field, environmental history of the Civil War, that people have taken it seriously, of course, starting with military historians and then branching out from there. Can you kind of give us some general background on how the field of environmental history as it pertains to the war has evolved since it really came into its own? What would you say, a decade, 2 decades ago, really, in terms of the kind of big topics that people have tackled and how that's kind of moved the field along from the initial engagement that military historians had with it?
You can go back to the 1940s, really, and find Douglas Southall Freeman, of all people, begging people to send him weather information. But apparently no one ever really did. So if we move forward into the 1980s, there are environmental historians. Jack Temple Kirby immediately comes to mind, who wrote an essay who just wondered, why aren't environmental historians and Civil War historians even talking to each other? And he clearly saw ways that we could communicate and enrich each other's work. What it really took were some pioneering historians. Lisa Brady comes immediately to mind, Megan Kate Nelson, Katie Shively, whom you had on a few weeks ago, who created these really sort of path-breaking studies of the Civil War. Megan Nelson coming from the background of environmental history into Civil War. Katie Shively's in a different direction. She's coming in from Civil War. But, really establishing the notion that we could learn more about the war if we consider it in the environmental context. And by the time those books were out, the one factor that Kirby mentioned that no one really had dealt with a lot was weather, which happened to be the thing that interested me the most. So we're starting to see more work now. I know there's some graduate students out there, various places. There are a couple of new books out. There's a neat new book out on the wilderness, trying to understand that in an environmental context. One of my own grad students is working on camps. I mean, the environmental, physical reality of camp life. My shout out to Peter Thomas at Peter's watching tonight. But yeah, it's a very, very new approach to Civil War. As I think both of you know, it tends to be a pretty conservative discipline, not politically conservative, but just conservative in the ways that we do history. We miss postmodernism completely in Civil War studies. So yeah, it's relatively new, and I'm following in the footsteps of some really good scholars who have pointed, I think, important directions for us.
Yeah. Yeah, and as you mentioned, in the early part of your book, talking about the weather as kind of a third force, is kind of the framework of your book. That was Union armies, Confederate armies, and then, the weather. So the idea of weather having agency, but then also you bring out the very important topic of how soldiers then respond to the weather in ways that, develop, industrial, production of, overcoats and rubber blankets and things like that. Winter quarters, kind of new practices of self-care along the lines of Katie Shively, and numerous other, issues. So it's not only the weather acting as the agent, but then the soldiers kind of having to assert a new kind of agency, never tackling the weather because you can't, but they have to assert new agency in new ways to try to engage with it, which I thought was an important part of your work.
I thought that was a really important thing to do. Really early in the project, one of my colleagues, Rupa Mishra at Auburn, who studies the East India Company, asked me if I had read Mike Davis's book, Late Victorian Holocausts, which turned out to be a book that influenced my Howling Storm book a lot. And one of the things that Davis points out is that it's easy to say the weather did things. It's easy to say that 3 major El Nino events between 1877 and 1902 killed upwards of 30 to 50 million people in Asia and Africa and South America. But it wasn't just the weather that did that. It was people's interactions with those weather conditions. And in Davis's case, he's talking about how imperial regimes, notably the British, but also the French and the Germans, came in and dismantled local systems that had been erected to deal with flooding or to deal with drought. They made it worse while simultaneously weakening those world nations and ultimately making them easier to conquer. And I thought, surely the same thing was happening in the Civil War. Surely it's not just a situation where guys are getting cold. What are they doing about getting cold? How are they surviving these winters? And that really got me interested in winter shelter, which, as you guys know, is an important part of the book. I'm fascinated by how the Confederates and the Federals are creating different kinds of shelters from the first winter and how that evolves over time and what that tells us about those armies and what it tells us about the war. So, yeah.
So tell us, Ken, what does it tell us about the armies?
Well, I mean, if you go back to 1861, 62, the first winter, on the one hand, you got Joe Johnston, who's ready to start building cabins in October. Hey, we're going into winter quarters. He's never really able to do it as much as he wants. I mean, he's hoping for milled lumber at one point. But the Confederates end up living in cabins, the sort of cabins that many of them probably had back on maybe the southwestern frontier. For political reasons, the Army of the Potomac never goes into winter quarters. That would have been politically damaging to McClellan and really to the Lincoln administration. So they make the decision, no, we're going to stay under canvas because we're ready to move at a moment's notice. Well, the soldiers see this, and a lot of them take matters into their own hands, and they start building these hybrid structures, the sort of things you see at some parks today, log walls with the canvas on top. So they're technically still under canvas, but they're finding ways to survive, and they're doing it very much at the lower level. These are regimental decisions. Well, they're individual decisions, but this is happening at the regimental level, sometimes at the brigade level. There are all these debates in the first year over what's the best way to heat a cabin, what's the best way to keep warm. Various methods are discussed. Some are used, some are discarded. As you go through the war, that continues for a while. Confederates continue to have a preference for cabins when they've got the wood. The Federals continue building these hybrid structures. And then you reach a really interesting point in the last winter of the war, especially around Petersburg, where a lot of the territory held by the Confederates has been denuded. They can't build their cabins. Well, what do? They captured a lot of federal canvas over the years. So the Confederates end up mostly under canvas. Confederates also don't have tools. They don't have enough axes. They don't have adzes. They don't have the things they need to build a proper cabin. So they end up living under a lot of captured canvas while the Federals are living a bit better under their hybrid structures. It's a vernacular architecture that I think most people have never really studied. I don't think anyone studies this in architecture school. But it's just interesting that you see initially differences between North and South, and then you see practicality intervene, and then at the end you see the effect that the devastation of force, because you're building all those earthworks and you need all that wood. It's a progression through the war that I think tells us something about the war. But the common thread is that you've got guys who are trying to stay warm and dry. Right. And what's the best way to do it this winter?
Well, yeah, I think that what your book affirms much of what Katie Shively found in terms of self-care and the adaptability and the pragmatism that soldiers reveal. I'm going to get another sort of bigger question here now. So let's talk about an El Nino pattern. And if you could just, again, for the people at home, give us a sense as to what that actually means, because some of us might not be up on our terminology when it comes to the weather. And then also just explain how it had an impact on one period of the war. And
sure.
Let you take your pick.
Sure. Well, El Nino, normally through summer and fall into early winter, currents across the Pacific stretch essentially from northeastern Australia and Indonesia across the Pacific to the coast of Peru. And those currents normally are moving warm water east to west. So you've got warm water that's pooling around Indonesia, and the ocean off of Peru and Ecuador is really, really cold. That's in a normal year. And those temperatures rise to the surface and they get caught up by the winds, and the jet stream does certain things because of that. And that's a so-called normal weather pattern. What happens in El Nino, for reasons that meteorologists still really do not understand, is that the current shifts. It's sometimes compared to a seesaw or conveyor belt. It shifts. The warm currents start moving west to east because the easterly winds have become weaker, and the water off of Peru heats up maybe 4 or 5 degrees around Christmas time, hence El Nino, the Christ child. And as that warm water rises to the surface, gets caught up in the winds blowing from west to east, it changes weather patterns. It shifts the jet stream. Weather patterns change around the world. Now, what's going on in the Civil War actually is still in some dispute. When I first started the project, it seemed to most people that the Civil War years, by and large, were mild El Nino years. And then as I got into the project, there was a very influential study which suggested that, in fact, most of the Civil War period encompassed a so-called La Nina year, which is sometimes called extreme normal. And then as I was, working on the book some more, um, talking from time to time with the wonderful Carrie Mock at the University of South Carolina, I found out that, well, recent studies have suggested no, these were El Nino years after all. Um, so you got that happening. I'll mention too, our local weather folks always talk about El Nino when it becomes a factor. We all remember poor Chris Farley as El Nino on Saturday Night Live. There's a similar thing happening out in the Atlantic called the North Atlantic Oscillation, which runs essentially from a permanent low pressure system around Iceland to a permanent high pressure system in the Azores. But sometimes the differences in pressure become greater or lesser, again, for reasons that no one really quite understands. And what seems to have been happening during the Civil War is this, that 1861 was probably a La Nina year. Think about the extreme heat during the Wilson's Creek campaign, for example, or even, First Bull Run. And then around December of 1861, the first series of El Nino events begins. You get another one in 1864. You've also got the North Atlantic Oscillation becoming lesser, a negative North Atlantic Oscillation during those same war years. And the result is just some really weird weather in the United States. I think we've always assumed that the Civil War took place in a winter like all other winters. It was a normal period of time. It was not. The weather in the Civil War was very unusual, and I think those unusual weather patterns really, really affected the progress of the war.
Could you then very quickly speak about the fall of 1862? I think many of us were well aware of the drought, particularly in the South, and then talk about 1863 and Lee's decision to go into Pennsylvania and how the environment figured into what you believe are some of the calculations for the last raid into the North.
Well, here's an example. We were talking earlier about, what is environmental history after the Civil War. I think that's a really good example that you bring up. Let me go back a little bit farther, though. The spring of 1862, the spring, is incredibly wet and cold. And we know that farmers across the South were getting their crops into the field probably a month later than they normally would have. And the ones who actually start early, it's unsuccessful. They have to go back and replant. So they're starting late. Then you get into June or July, depending on where you are, east or west of the Appalachians, and this massive drought sets in. And the drought sets in and it lasts until November in some places. So what do you have? You have late planting at the beginning of 1862. You have drought in the middle of 1862. You have devastating harvests, if you want to call them that, at the end of 1862. So there is a food shortage in the Confederacy. This isn't happening up north in 1862. You've got bumper crops being brought in 1862. It's the best year for agriculture of the war in the North. That's probably El Nino related. It's also a negative North Atlantic Oscillation related. But what happens in 1863? The same darn thing happens. You get another cold, wet winter. You get late planting again in 1863. It's clear that there are going to be real problems with food supply in the Confederacy in 1863. Where is agriculture doing well? It's doing well up north. It's doing well in Pennsylvania. We want to believe that Southern agriculture has been devastated because a lot of men are gone. That's true. Because people are escaping slavery. That's true. Because rail lines are being cut, transportation is breaking down. That's all true. But the foundational problem at that moment is heavy rain in planting season followed by drought. And the reality of serious food shortages. Joan Cashin's book, War Stuff, came out a few years ago, and a few people raised their eyebrows when she said that there was real famine in the Confederacy. I think there was real famine in the Confederacy. So if you're going to feed your army, you can't stay there. You have to go north to where things are much better. And that's what Lee does. It's not the only reason he goes forth. I'm not an environmental determinist any more than I'm an anything determinist. I don't think environment causes everything. That's the only reason. But it's there. We've forgotten about it. And I think it makes that decision to go north entirely understandable. My ancestors, my Confederate ancestors who were out there riding around in Ewell's Corps, what were they doing most of the time? They were stealing stuff. They were gathering food and horses and supplies and everything they could so they could drag it all back south.
And so many times, when we look at letters from soldiers, both North and South, but, especially from Southern soldiers, entering Pennsylvania and Maryland first, but then especially in Pennsylvania before Gettysburg, and reflecting on how jubilant and how uplifted they were just by seeing the beauty of the landscape and the abundance that was there. And just despite the fact that those marches were brutal because of, heat and because of lack of water and et cetera, and just the length of the marches that these soldiers were doing, that booster to morale was enormous for these guys who are, coming onto Northern soil and seeing, here's everything that's there for the taking. So obviously, as your book brings out, the impact of the environment on morale, on nationalism for both civilians and soldiers, that's huge. That plays a huge role. And of course, in Richmond, in April of '63, we have the bread riots. So you have to, of course, figure in the environmental factors as well as the political and social factors that lead to that, which kind of leads me to a related question, that when you have civilians and soldiers competing for the same limited food supplies, especially in the South, and you also have very different experiences of how the environment impacts you if you're a soldier versus a civilian. You kind of have the armchair civilians, the armchair politicians who say, well, why can't you move your army, 20 more miles today? Or why can't you follow up, after that major battle and take advantage of the retreat of the enemy? But, there's, I would assume, a difference in the morale that, civilians back at home are frustrated that they can't understand why soldiers can't accomplish what they think is, completely manageable, but soldiers are on the ground experiencing a much different reality. Does that kind of create additional fissures between home front and soldiers, between politicians and on the ground generals, trying to explain, well, why aren't you doing this? And well, why can't you understand the realities that we're facing? It seems like they're two vastly different experiences that would create, enormous tension at key moments in the war.
Soldiers believe that they have earned the right to eat. They can't defend the Confederacy. Union soldiers can't defend the United States if they can't eat. So they begin foraging for very practical reasons. Later on, well, not later on, by summer of 1862, I write about this in the Perryville book. Some people have figured out that there are political reasons to deprive Southern civilians of food as well, because it may make them give up quicker. But there is a limited supply of food in the war zone. And soldiers believe they have a right to it. And civilians just need to toughen up and get through it and support them. I think it's interesting, too, that the Davis administration ultimately makes the same decision. All of us talk in our Civil War classes about the internalist notion that the Confederacy fell apart from within because of things like conscription or the taxing kind or impressment. And we ask ourselves, how incompetent were these Confederate congressmen and administrators alienating the common people of the South by implementing these laws? Well, they're implementing these laws because they have a real practical problem. There's only so much food, and they have to make a choice. Do we feed the army or do we feed the civilian population? They make the choice to feed the army, which, as we all know, alienates a good chunk of the civilian population. African Americans, obviously, from the beginning, and for a host of other reasons, women for a host of other reasons. You mentioned the Richmond bread riot. We can talk about the political reasons for the riot, but we always forget that it had been really cold and there had been flooding and all the bridges into Richmond had been knocked out and there was no food coming into the city. I mean, there was a real starvation problem in Richmond at that moment. But also just the common people who may have had a son or two or a husband gone, and now the armies or the government's coming through and taking what little they have, and they're dealing with this situation every day. In the Confederacy, they're dealing with rain, then drought in 1862 and 1863. And in Virginia, it happens again in 1864. Things actually get a little better in the Deep South in 1864, but only because the drought pattern shifts north and hits New England and hits the Midwest for the first time. But in Virginia, they get it 3 years in a row. And it's, I think, no wonder that a lot of them just get sick of the war. I think I said this the first time I gave a talk on this topic, and I think it still holds. I think after all my research that changed my mind on a lot of things, I will stick with this statement. The founding fathers of the Confederacy, as it turned out, picked the absolute worst time to launch an agricultural, slave-based republic in wartime because the weather ultimately turned against them and made it a lot more difficult. Didn't make it impossible. Made it difficult for them to succeed.
So, Ken, I just want to, it's not so much pushback to some of these ideas. I'm just, I'm puzzled. I'm puzzled by the fact that the evidence in your book is so overwhelming that on both sides, the weather played, again, a critical factor, and you're not deterministic about it at all. I think we all appreciate that as historians, we want to try to recover and examine the totality of an experience. And you, I think, have reminded us, as other scholars have, about the importance of the environmental impact on war or military operations. But here's where I guess I'm a little confused. I'm confused that on both sides, whether it be McClellan or Lee, take your pick, or even Jefferson Davis or Abraham Lincoln, why is it that in the face of what we see with hindsight, that the weather was so crucial, that these officers in particular had all kinds of evidence right at their fingertips to explain away their lack of success, but they didn't do it? And how do we account for the fact that, again, obviously the weather's the air they breathed, but at the end of the day, not only did they not really acknowledge it, I think, as much as one might expect, but hell, if I was McClellan, I'd have been pointing to the weather all the time. And, if I was George Gordon Meade after Gettysburg, I'd be blaming the rain for a lot of this. But that didn't happen. So how do we explain that? Because it appears they have a very different disposition toward weather as a way to understand human interaction.
I would argue that it did happen. See, I'm going to push back on your pushback.
Please do.
Okay. If you read McClellan's letters and reports during and after the Peninsula Campaign, he talks about the weather all the time. And he does make that excuse. We could not get there. We need better roads. We need to dry the army out. He talks about it all the time. So does Meade after Gettysburg. A lot of commanders did exactly that. They pointed out the reality. And their subordinates did as well.
But there's still there's an expectation that they should overcome it. I mean, Burnside look at Burnside. My God. I mean, he's succumbing to political pressure, and he's obviously, this maneuver was actually quite strong, but it's the rain that did him in. Hell, nobody now, of course, Fredericksburg didn't help his cause, but nobody was giving him, no one gave Meade a break, and they certainly didn't give McClellan a break. It still seems to me that there's a very different attitude about weather. You can keep going and give us some Confederate examples as well. In all seriousness, I'd be interested.
I think the armchair general is not a new phenomenon.
Right.
And I think the average person, north or south, sitting at home reading the newspapers is going to be wondering, why isn't the army moving? Why didn't McClellan take Richmond? Why didn't Meade trap Lee north of the Potomac? But the ultimate armchair general of the American Civil War was Abraham Lincoln. And when you talk about, nobody gave McClellan a break or nobody gave Burnside a break, I mean, in some ways, what you're really saying is that Lincoln didn't give them a break. Now, I'm a Lincoln fan.
No,
about,
listen, I'm sorry. I want to say something, Ken. Look, this is bold, man. The guy is not even in Illinois for even 2 days, and he's got within spitting distance of Springfield. And man, you're going after old Abe. I'm
hey,
glad there's not any identification on the wall behind you. Or get egg tonight or something worse. But go right
you
ahead.
know, about 10 feet from where I'm sitting right now is my Abraham Lincoln poster that was on my
No, wait,
office door
you
at
don't have to
Auburn
defend
for
yourself.
21 years. But I also studied here with the late and wonderful Bob Johansen, who, of course, among other things, was the great biographer of Stephen A. Douglas. So, I was trained to criticize Lincoln a little bit.
All right.
I think he was our greatest president. I do. But I don't think he was a perfect human being. I don't think he was a perfect commander in chief. And I don't believe that he ever really grasped logistics or the reality of moving troops on the ground. There's a wonderful historian of the environment, the American environment, Mark Feige, who talks about Lincoln a little bit. And Feige points out that Lincoln has what Feige calls a Whiggish mentality. It's a mentality that is fairly common in the mid 19th century, and it is this notion that in this modern time in which we live, people can overcome the environment. I mean, think about Lincoln himself trying to find a way to overcome the falls at New Salem and make that some sort of viable commercial river. The environment is there to be tamed, to be overcome. Lincoln gravitates toward generals who agree with him, notably U.S. Grant, who will push through no matter what. But not all of them do. And a lot of the generals that we always end up saying bad things about in the classroom, McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, Don Carlos Buell, they do, use your word, they do push back and say, look, what you're asking of us is almost impossible. You're asking me, Don Carlos Buell, to take my army into East Tennessee in the winter when that region has already been scoured and the weather is terrible and there's not much to eat there anyway. My men are going to starve to death. They do push back. What happens to Buell? He gets fired. Burnside gets fired. Hooker gets fired. There's
Ken, I think you're onto something there, and it's not just, I think, to Lincoln. I think it's actually the cultural belief in willed behavior, and the strength of the individual to overcome and to control circumstances. I think it's pervasive, and I think that even many of the subordinate commanders on both sides, as well as the enlisted men, they believed in their heart of hearts that as men that they could prove their character, as we know, through suffering, and more importantly, for overcoming insurmountable odds. I mean, it's Lee, of all the generals that I've ever studied, he seems time and time again disconnected from the reality that his men faced, particularly after Gettysburg. The logistical breakdown, man, that is no joke. But in his mind, his men, if they're true soldiers and true patriots, they overcome that. And they overcome it even if the weather is turned against them as well. So I think your book does something very interesting, and I think it opens up a cultural disposition on both sides. I think you're right. I think, would you mind, Ken, before we go back to Ashley here? I've looked up the book that you just mentioned, and that author, and he's done, I think, a book on the environmental history of the U.S. Could you say his name again for the folks at home? I guess I could type it. This is a first
Mark,
here.
Mark Feige, F-I-E-G-E.
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 March. See, Ashley, look, I try. It never works. Here we go.
My students give me a hard time when I do that.
God.
While you're typing, I will say that if we can bring Lee into this conversation too.
Please, yeah.
Read Lee's letters after Cheat Mountain when he's writing to John Letcher or writing to his wife saying, it would have worked had it not been for the weather. The weather undid me. Lee absolutely makes that excuse in West Virginia at the end of 1861.
Not willing to make it after Gettysburg, of course.
You know, I have a follow-up on the point about kind of illuminating cultural dispositions. I thought it's fascinating how you had noted that even some Northern soldiers would look at the nature of the makeup of the soil in the South as kind of reflective of kind of the cultural degeneracy of the Confederacy, that this is what happens, this poor, thick, sticky, muddy, clay that they have to walk through. It's terrible for growing in these particular growing seasons when the weather is so bad, as kind of evidence of, these are not kind of the chosen people, and this is what happens to kind of a backward, slaveholding society, is that it destroys the land, it destroys, the people, it destroys everything, which I thought was, a really fascinating kind of revelation. But then to kind of go off of that, you had mentioned that some soldiers could look to the weather and explain it as divine providence, interceding. Well, the rains came and saved us from Meade's force after Gettysburg. Lee's army could clearly say that it bogged him down. It inhibited his ability to follow us in the retreat. Or conversely, people in Meade's army could look at the rains bogging down the Confederate army and saying, well, God was on our side, just waiting for us to snatch it up, and we failed in that regard. But you said that most soldiers in your research didn't actually explain weather as a divine force. And yet there were so many instances in your book where obviously ministers, but newspaper editors and people on the home front did seem to explain it as, well, this clearly shows that, God is on our side. And, the war comet of 1861 appearing in the sky, like you talk about when the war is beginning, and, stormy weather coinciding with the stormy opening events of the war, that people made those connections. Why is there a seeming divergence between how soldiers didn't really turn to that explanation and see weather in the religious prism, through the religious prism, whereas civilians on the home front, it seems like they often did?
Well, I think there are a couple of things going on. First thing I have to do is I have to add a footnote, because I hope I'm a good historian. I read a wonderful book a few years ago by Adam Wesley Dean, who talked about how part of the abolitionist critique of slavery, the part that we've all forgotten about, is how it had destroyed the South environmentally. They don't have the geological knowledge that we have, and they just assume that this horrible red clay that's all over the South was something that had been created by wasteful slave labor. So I wanted to see how much of that turns up during the war as Union soldiers are writing home about it. And it turns up a lot. They hate the stuff, but they don't just think it's impractical. They think it's immoral. It's evil soil, which is an interesting argument. As for divine providence, Ashley, I went into this book just assuming that soldiers would spend a lot of their time talking about exactly what you've explained. God intervened, God raised the river and saved us, God brought the rain. And I did not run into much of that at all. Yeah, you can find it on the home front, absolutely. I think it's interesting, though, you can generally find it on the home front when things are going well on that home front. I spent several days crawling through Southern sermons, that have been published and preserved. So you miss a lot of them. They're just off the cuff, the sorts of, the Holy Spirit will touch you, and here's a sermon that nobody writes down. But in terms of, fairly influential divines who were publishing these things, in the Confederacy, they talk a lot about God's favor as demonstrated through the weather in 1861. And then when things go bad, they drop the subject. They just don't go there. Now, I did not look at Northern sermons closely at all, but from scattered things I have looked at over the years, I think that idea remains. God is blessing us through favorable weather conditions. If we could just get rid of these terrible generals, we would have victories. It's it is part of the culture. It's not as much a part of the 19th century culture as I expected. They're kind of on the cusp there between providential explanations of weather and scientific explanations of weather. And they're not there yet. They're not going to get to the notion of, say, cold fronts and warm fronts until early in the 20th century. But they're already starting to think along those lines. One of the things we haven't talked about is that a lot of the data that I use in the book comes from a program that the Smithsonian created in the mid-1840s, and it lasts until 1861. It lasts in the North all the way through the war. It kind of falls apart in the Confederacy, but not completely. But there's, what was really the leading scientific institution in the United States around 1844, 1845, saying there is a natural scientific reason that weather happens the way it does. And what we need to do is collect a whole lot of data and try to figure out what it is. I think, Pete talked about the culture a moment ago. Culture is shifting in this period, and you can kind of see that shift in the way that people deal with weather conditions and, a host of other things too.
It reminds me, Ken, and again, we're not trying to overgeneralize here about cultural dispositions, but it's clear that, both sides at the beginning of the war expected to be able to read God's intentions in daily affairs. And of course, the battle and the outcome of a military engagement would be reflective of who God's chosen people. And even in the battle itself, as we know, that theoretically the bravest, those who are the most Christian or the most virtuous, that they would maybe come out on the other side alive. But it was, again, clear that there was a certain randomness about fighting as well. It just strikes me that maybe one reason why a lot of Civil War Americans stopped saying, hey, we can't read the weather because we can't even read what's going on in our daily lives, in military operations, large and small. So it seems to me there's a certain confusion, a metaphysical confusion that I think Northerners and Southerners, they're contending with because of war operations. And the weather is just one thing that's part of it. We don't know what's going on. There's got to be some purpose to this. And it reminds me again of I think even Lincoln's second inaugural as well.
I was just thinking about it. I mean, Lincoln says that in the second inaugural. I was sitting here thinking both sides, read the same Bible, worship the same God. What is God doing? We don't know why any of this is happening.
You're now you're calling on Lincoln now. I think you're trying what you're doing here. And
I'm going to get my poster and show you my poster.
No, I don't think that's even wrong, man. You're insulting the guy and you got the poster right over your shoulder. Yeah.
I'm that kind of person.
I have another follow-up on the cultural questions about all of this. Back in March, we were talking with Jonathan Jones about opioid addiction among Civil War veterans. And we were talking about how Civil War soldiers and the general public viewed opioid addiction as, it was emasculating, it was a sign of weakness, even though Civil War soldiers understood how you could get addicted to it for being treated for horrible diseases and horrible pain and amputation pain and all of that. So I'm wondering about how soldiers viewed the weather's impact on the male body. I know that your book does not focus, a ton on gender, and you acknowledge that in the introduction. But I'm wondering how soldiers responded. I'm getting some echo there for some reason. How soldiers responded when their comrade would just drop out of the march, faint on the side of the road. Is that a sign of human weakness? Is that a sign of the weather's really, really hot and this guy doesn't have water, he hasn't eaten in 3 days? How do they respond when the weather impacts one's mind? The soldier, I forget his name, but you stated very powerfully a quote that he had where, even after Gettysburg, the Union soldier, morale should have been high. These guys should have been, living, the dream life despite, all the horrific casualties that the Union Army suffered. And yet he is so bogged down by the weather, the horrific rain, the mud afterwards, that he just says, I just want to give up. I just feel like, dying. That weather could have that kind of an impact on the mental well-being of soldiers seems, it's startling, I guess. I mean, it would be normal for them, but for us coming from a 21st century perspective, it's startling. So I'm curious as to whether you found any reflections on that, whether soldiers looked at their comrades as weak, if they had a mental, breakdown because of just being overwhelmed by the weather and the, exhaustion and the stress on the body, or looked at those soldiers as being physically weak if they couldn't keep up with the army, or they did find themselves debilitated when most of their comrades could continue on the long march or continue through those long, cold winters. Did you find any of that?
I found some of it, but not much. I think most of them recognize that harsh weather conditions could devastate the human body, and that if their buddy got sick and the soldier, my buddy's sick and I survive, I don't think he's weak. They're not saying my friend is weak. They're saying we were lucky. Maybe I was smarter in hiding under that hay bale last night. Maybe I'm better led in that I have shoes and the guys in the next brigade don't. But I didn't see succumbing to weather described as a weakness in most cases. I mean, yes, there are exceptions. I had a wonderful conversation with our friend Carol Reardon a couple of years ago as Pickett's men are lining up to make the charge at Gettysburg. It's so hot. It's the hottest day of battle. Some of them are dropping of heat stroke. And there are officers who assume they're shamming because, you're weak, you're a coward, you don't want to go into battle, you're faking heat stroke. And clearly there are soldiers writing about this saying, John really did have heat stroke. So people make those assumptions, but by and large, no, I don't think they saw it as evidence of weakness any more than veterans saw, or at least some veterans saw opioid addiction after the war in the same way as they would have before the war. We know from some really good studies that people change their minds about suicide pre-war, post-war. I think there's more understanding of what body and soul went through in that conflict, at least among the people who share that experience. Civilians are often left out of it.
That's what I was wondering, whether there was a wedge between the civilian perceptions of the impact of weather environment on the male body, or whether it was more kind of in line with the soldiers. But it seems like it's, it's the former, that soldiers and those who experienced the same thing had a much better understanding for the devastating effects on the body.
I think you're exactly right. I think a veteran extended to another veteran. Oh, wait, he's suffering from heat stroke. This guy's been dependable before. Although there certainly was a concern that a malingerer would use that time and time again. We might have some questions, but I'm going to give you a quick one here because the Adams County Chamber of Commerce requires it. And so I'd like for you to tell us something about the Gettysburg campaign and the environment that either surprised you or maybe shifted our understanding or interpretation of the battle.
I knew about the weather during the battle. I knew about the heavy rain after the battle because that's been written about. What I did, two things that I learned. One, how incredibly hot it was for soldiers marching into Pennsylvania, especially the Federals, because they're east of the mountains. The weather there is clearly warmer. They're running into that red clay dust, whereas Lee's men aren't. So a lot of them are in pretty rough shape by the time they get to Adams County. The other thing I didn't know was that there was rain right before the battle. The field was still partially wet on July 1st. And, if I were a licensed battlefield guide, I'm sure I would know that, but that was new to me.
Yeah. You mentioned the rains post Gettysburg. That brings us to a question that we do have, which I think is a common one, at least that I used to hear when I was leading tours with the Park Service on battlefields, about concussion theory. And the idea that, the tremendous artillery barrages would trigger, these horrendous rainfalls, torrential rainfalls after big battles, and how in so many instances that's been recorded. So it must be true. And I know you wrote about it in your book that some soldiers explained, the weather and the torrential rains in that same way, that, it must have had something to do, with the artillery and the thunderous sounds and vibrations. But that theory has since been somewhat debunked, yes?
Yeah. First of all, it's a myth. Loud artillery will not create conditions to cause rain. It happened enough that a lot of soldiers started to believe it, and not just privates and corporals. I mean, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain endorses this theory after the war. Sherman eventually endorses this theory after the war. But what they conveniently forget are all those battles where there wasn't any rain afterward. It's kind of funny. It's like my grandmother, God rest her soul, my grandmother was convinced that it always rained on Good Friday. The sky always turns dark and it rains on Good Friday. And she would tell me that. And every year it was sunny, I would point it out to her and she would just blow me off. And, a few weeks later, she would be telling me that, the sky always weeps on Good Friday. You remember the times that reinforce what you believe and you ignore the rest.
You're a real contrarian, man. You take on Lincoln, now you take on your poor grandma. I mean,
I love my grandma.
Sacred.
The only thing she was ever wrong about.
I heard in southern Indiana, and I do believe this, if you see cows laying down on the ground, it will rain. I'm serious. Take note. Cows laying down. Maybe they're arthritic. I'm not sure, but I'm
Oh
serious.
my
I
God.
heard that. Yeah,
My
cows
grandfather
laying
said
down.
the same thing in Virginia, but you're going to say I'm betraying my grandfather too.
I
Actually,
didn't say
that may
that.
be
That's a
true.
criticism.
Cows are smart.
They
Cows are
are smart.
smarter than you think.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there is a theory. Not only are soldiers spreading this theory after the war, but eventually a book is written trying to prove it. The federal government provides money and all sorts of artillery pieces to help people try to prove it, and they can't prove it. And you get to the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, and what do you have? You have people running around in the middle of Oklahoma with surplus howitzers trying to bring rain.
Right.
And I can think of at least one modern book, I won't mention the author of the name, at least one modern book that asserts this is fact, and it's not. But they believed it. And, we've ended up in the second half of this hour talking about culture. I think it's just fascinating. That's an interesting part of culture that they did believe it. In a way, they are saying we can manipulate weather.
The weather. Right.
How can we learn to manipulate weather?
Right. And still the pervasive belief that even in the face of a catastrophic weather event, that human will and intelligence should not only anticipate, but that the aftershocks of that we should manage to near perfection. I'm astonished about the hurricanes that have devastated this country over the last 10 years. I don't care what administration is in power, but it's shocking the lack of understanding and empathy for people at all levels of government. And that we are expecting them to be able to meet this with the kind of, I don't know, foresight that is just not possible. Not to mention you just don't have that capacity to be able to contend with these things. So you still see a legacy of, I think, of how Americans look at weather. There's a respect for it, but there's still a belief that we can somehow govern it and control it.
We actually have a follow-up on the cow situation.
Yes.
Someone has written in that the reason why cows lie down before the rain is because their udders become uncomfortable with the increased humidity.
Yes.
There you
That's
go.
the kind of scientific evidence that I have needed with my family for years. My wife scoffs at much of what I say, but she's been utterly resistant to that. Hell, man, she's a Jersey girl. What does she know? We're Midwesterners. I'm from Indiana. I grew up next to a cornfield, for whatever that's worth. But
cows are smarter than we give them credit for. I had a conversation many years ago with the wonderful Kurt Holman, who was then manager at Perryville, and he reminded me that sometimes when historians or archaeologists are trying to find ancient roads, what they do is they bring in a herd of cows and turn them loose. And the cattle will always find the obvious path across the mountain or around the mountain, and that's where the road's going to be.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, Ken, we so appreciate you taking time. Yeah, serious, man. You just landed in Illinois, what, 2 days ago? A few days ago?
Since Sunday, so 4.
Yeah, you're surrounded by books, but we've all taken note because I think you've said it 3 times. I'll say it 4 times. Although your books are not up, you have no furniture. He put his Lincoln poster on the wall immediately. So, yeah, you're doing right by the people there. And, I just want to, congratulate you on a wonderful career at Auburn and knowing that you will now have lots more time to write. And I hope that you will get an opportunity to come out to CWI and to speak again. We would love for that
I'd
to
love
happen.
to.
Yeah, keep an eye on your student, Jen Murray. Keep her in line. Right? We devoted a single staff member to watch over her. Right?
Yeah, you say that like it's easy.
It's not easy. It's not
It's
easy.
not easy.
I just want to show the book again, The Howling Storm. It is a thunderously good book. How's that?
Good.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank God this is the last show. But before we sign off, I just want to make note. And Ashley is saying, the Vegas odds are not good on this. I always get dates wrong, but I believe that June 11th, 12th, and 13th, I know. We're going to have our virtual conference. Unfortunately, CWI, we cannot meet in person. We're going to begin on the 11th with a panel on Carol Reardon's book on Gettysburg and Pickett's Charge and Memory. So we'll have a panel, and Ashley will be part of that. And then and it'll be live, I should note as well. It will be live. People can send in their questions. And then be followed with a panel with the Gettysburg Battlefield Guides. We have 4 guides, and I will be the moderator. And again, live, people can send in their questions. So that's Friday. That's the 11th. And then on the 12th, we will begin with another live show with Kent Masterson Brown, who has a new book on George Gordon Mead, and it will be coming out like maybe next week. And so we'll spend some time with Kent. We'll take a break at lunch, and then Mr. No, Jen Murray is going to be talking about Barksdale's Brigade. We're going to pre-record her tour, and then we're going to go over to everybody knows, of course, Gabor Bort, my predecessor and my absolutely dear friend. We're going to go to his house, and his barn on his property was used as a field hospital for Barksdale's Brigade. So we're going to finish up there, take a quick break, and then Dr. Lusky is up. She is doing a program on civilians at the Rose Farm. We're going to be taping that as well. And I think that concludes our programs for Saturday. Again, that is the 12th. And then on the 13th, Ashley, Scott Hartwig, and 2 of the students at Gettysburg College, we ventured down to Antietam about, was it a month ago, 3 weeks ago?
Yeah, it was a little less than that, 3 weeks. Yeah.
Talking about weather, Ken, man, it almost just absolutely ruined the day. It was spitting snow. It was so
the
cold.
epitome of the howling storm.
Yes, it was.
It was.
I was hoping seriously that the camera wouldn't work and that we just would have to go home and do it another day. I was miserable. But as soon as Mr. Hartwig, who has finished his 2nd volume of his study of Antietam, as soon as he started talking, man, it was a great day. So we did a bunch of bits. That's what I think they say in the business, right? Bits. We did a bunch of bits on the battlefield. And so we had Cameron Sowers. He was one of the students. Ben Roy was another student. Had these nice little conversations with Scott. So we're going to do that on Sunday. And we are going to be with Scott after we show the bit, the recorded tape. We'll be live, and so people can send in questions as well. So that is our CWI conference. Again, we'd much rather see our people in person, but we are absolutely going to do that in 2022. And then the final little advertisement about this is that, and Ashley can help me out here, you register. Is that correct, Ashley?
Yes, everyone has to register.
There's no cost. There's no cost. Or we would, again, if you can find it in your ability to maybe make a donation, because of course we fund a lot of student programs. We right now are sending out almost 33 students to various national parks this summer, and of course almost all of them are Civil War related. We are very much committed to training young historians, just as Mr. No did at Auburn. So again, I want to say a big thank you to Dr. Lusky, to Ashley, again, my former student so long ago, and now a wonderful colleague. And I've so enjoyed working with her. It's been really a lot of fun. And we're going to resurrect this next fall, right, Ashley?
We are. Yeah, we'll be back with a new slate, a new lineup to be determined. But yeah, we'll be coming back next fall with Finding the Source.
Will be. So again, Ken, this was really a great way to end. I just want to say one more time, man. Hey, thanks so much for your contributions to the field. Thank you so much for all the students that you've mentored. And man, we're looking forward to getting you here to Gettysburg, and we'll let you do your thing on Lincoln here. We'll get some bodyguards out there for you. Right?
Okay.
Make sure you're protected. All right. You don't have to worry about it. It's great seeing you, Ken. Good luck unpacking.
Same here.
All right, man. Take good care of yourself.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, you all.
Okay.
Take care of you all this evening and stay healthy. And we hope to see you June 11th, 12th, 13th at our virtual conference. Thanks so much.